Welcome to Dear Fans. Struggling dad buys shoes for his daughter. Then Caitlin Clark walks in and changes everything. It was a chilly evening just a few days before Christmas, and Mark Evans stood in the crowded shoe aisle of a discount store in Los Angeles staring at the price tag of a pair of glittery sneakers. They were the kind his 9-year-old daughter Emily had been begging for. Mark's fingers trembled slightly as he flipped the tag back around, sighing $49.99 more than he could justify spending. Mark wasn't completely broke, but had been tight since he lost his second job 3 months ago. His construction shifts weren't steady and the bills had piled up. Emily had been understanding, never complaining when her classmates got new backpacks or went on weekend trips, but Mark had noticed her eyes lingered on the shoes when they passed by store windows. Maybe after the holidays, he muttered to himself, forcing a smile, as he put the sneakers back on the shelf and turned to leave. Familiar voice said behind him, "Those are nice shoes." Mark froze. He knew that voice. It was impossible not to turning around. Slowly, he found himself face to face with Caitlin Clark. She was dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie of basketball tucked under one arm, her other hand in her pocket. Her blonde hair was pulled back, and her eyes held a kindness that caught Mark off guard. Mark blinked, sure he was imagining things. Why, yeah, there," he stammered. Caitlin's gaze shifted to the sneakers. "He had just sat down. Your daughter's size." Mark swallowed. "Yeah," but before he could finish, Caitlin
picked up the shoes, she asked,
tilting them slightly. Mark nodded, unsure of what else to say. Caitlin didn't hesitate. "Let's get them." Mark's eyes widened. "Oh, no, that's not necessary, he said quickly. Caitlin smiled, that easy, genuine smile she was known for. "It's Christmas, right? Let me." Mark hesitated. He wanted to refuse, but something in Caitlin's expression told him this wasn't just about buying shoes. It was a simple, quiet act of kindness. As they approached the register, Emily's laughter echoed in Mark's mind, the sound of her excitement when she'd opened the box. Mark finally exhaled. "Thank you," he said softly. Caitlin just nodded as if to say it was nothing, but to Mark it was everything. At the register, Mark could feel his throat tightening. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay composed. The cashier scanned the shoes, barely glancing at either of them. To her, it was just another sale, but to Mark it felt like something sacred, like a small miracle wrapped in shoebox cardboard. Caitlin had handed over her card without hesitation, her movements unhurried. The whole store seemed quieter now, as if the moment itself demanded silence. Mark watched the card slide through the reader, then glanced at Caitlin, still struggling to believe this was happening. "You have no idea how much this means," Mark said, his voice cracking slightly. Caitlin met his eyes with that same calm kindness. "I think I do," she replied softly. The box was placed in a plastic bag, and Caitlin handed it to Mark, as if she were giving him something far more valuable. "Listen," Caitlin said, almost hesitating, "if it's all right, maybe I could say hi to Emily when you give them to her." Mark blinked, stunned. "Wait, you do that?" Caitlin smiled faintly. "I got time." Mark let out a shaky breath, nodding. "I live just a few blocks from here. It's not much, but lead the way," Caitlin said, as if visiting a stranger's small apartment in a modest neighborhood was the most natural thing in the world. The walk home felt surreal. Mark kept glancing at Caitlin, half expecting her to disappear, but she remained right there, hands tucked into her hoodie pocket, quietly matching his steps. When they reached Mark's apartment, the dim hallway lights flickered. As he fumbled for his keys, he could hear Emily humming softly behind the door, probably coloring at the kitchen table. "Emily," Mark called gently. As he opened the door, she appeared from around the corner, her hair falling over her eyes as she peeked out. When she saw Caitlin standing behind her, her eyes widened in disbelief. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She simply stood, scared, clutching the colored pencils in her hand, as if afraid to move. Caitlin knelt down, meeting her gaze at eye level. "Hey," she said softly, "I heard you've been wanting some new shoes." Emily's eyes to the plastic bag in Mark's hand, then back to Caitlin. "These are for you," Caitlin added, pulling the box out and holding it out to her. Tears welded in Emily's eyes as she stepped forward. "Heasley, for me." Caitlin nodded. Emily looked up at her dad, who could only nod through his own tears. She carefully took the box, cradling it as if it were the most precious thing she'd ever held. Caitlin smiled gently. "Merry Christmas, Emily." Emily set the box down on the floor and, without warning, threw her arms around Caitlin, hugging her tightly. Caitlin's Eyes softened as she hugged her back, her hand resting lightly on Emily's shoulder. Mark stepped back, watching them in silence. For the first time in months, the weight on his chest felt a little lighter. The shoes were just shoes, but in that moment, they were also hope, a reminder that even in the hardest times, someone out there cared enough to help. As Caitlin finally stood, Mark shook her hand firmly. "Thank you," Mark whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Caitlin gave him a small nod. "Take care of her. And yourself then," with the same quiet grace. Caitlin left the apartment, disappearing down the dim hallway. Emily sat on the floor, hugging the shoebox tightly to her chest, her eyes shining brighter than any Christmas lights. And Mark knew this wasn't just a story they tell at Christmas. It was something they'd carry in their hearts for the rest of their lives. As the door closed behind Caitlin, the apartment felt different, warmer somehow, as if a quiet kind of magic had lingered in her wake. Later that night, after Emily had fallen asleep, with a shoebox tucked beside her bed, Mark sat alone at the kitchen table. He stared at the worn envelope that held their unpaid electric bill. The due date was circled in red, just 2 days away. Mark exhaled, slowly rubbing his temples. He didn't regret the shoes, not for a second, but reality always had a way of sneaking back, and a soft knock startled him. It was nearly midnight. Mark hesitated, then opened the door cautiously. Caitlin Clark stood there again, hands in her hoodie pocket, a quiet smile on her face. "I was nearby," Caitlin said. "Thought I check," and Mark blinked, unsure what to say. "She loved the shoes," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Caitlin nodded. "I could tell." Her eyes drifted to the envelope still sitting on the table. "Mind if I come in for a minute?" Mark stepped aside, and Kate walked in, her gaze thoughtful but never prying. As she sat down, her eyes rested on a photo hanging on the wall. Emily and Mark at the beach 2 summers ago. Emily's face was painted with ice cream, and Mark's arms wrapped tightly around her, holding her as if the whole world could disappear, and he wouldn't let go. "She's lucky to have you," Caitlin said, breaking the silence. Mark laughed softly, though it carried more exhaustion than humor. "I try, but sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough." Caitlin's gaze softened. "You are." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Mark ran his hand over his face, and when he looked up again, Caitlin was holding something out, an unmarked envelope. Mark hesitated. "What this?" Caitlin set it gently on the table. "A little something to get you through." Mark's heart pounded. He didn't want to open it, but at the same time, he couldn't resist. His fingers trembled as he peeled it open. Inside was a stack of $100 bills. Mark's breath caught in his chest. He looked up, shaking his head. Caitlin, I can't take this." Caitlin's eyes met his steady and kind. "Yes, you can." Mark swallowed hard, struggling to find words. "You don't even know us." Caitlin's voice was soft, almost distant. "I know enough." Before Mark could argue further, Caitlin, "Don't worry about paying me back. Just take care of her." Mark stood as well, his eyes burning. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. Caitlin gave him one last nod, then stepped into the hallway. Mark stood there long after she'd gone, staring at the envelope in his hand. In the quiet of that small apartment, something shifted, a weight lifted, a door opened, hope returned. And that night, for the first time in months, Mark let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. Though next morning, Mark woke to the sound of Emily laughing in the living room. Sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, painting the small space in soft gold. For a moment, he forgot about the overdue bills, the empty fridge, the weight of everything that had pressed on his shoulders for months. He found Emily sitting cross-legged on the floor, the shoebox now doubling as a treasure chest for her toys. She looked up at him with bright eyes. "I had a dream Caitlin was here," she said, grinning. Mark knelt beside her and brushed her hair back. "That wasn't a dream, sweetheart." Emily's eyes widened. "Really?" He nodded, smiling. "Really?" She hugged him tightly, and Mark held her just a little longer than usual. Later that afternoon, Mark sat by the window with a cup of coffee, watching Emily play outside. The envelope Caitlin had left still sat unopened on the table. Mark had counted the bills once, but he untouched them, since it wasn't until Emily ran back inside, cheeks flushed from the cold, that he remembered the envelope. She tugged on his sleeve, grinning. "Arrow, ear, Daddy, let's get ice cream tonight." "Justice," Mark laughed, shaking his head. "Ice cream? And December? You're crazy." Emily leaned against him, eyes pleading. "Come on, just one time." Mark glanced at the envelope, then back at Emily. Her hopeful eyes reminded him of all the times he had to say no, but not tonight. "All right," he said, ruffling her hair. "Let's go." They bundled up and walked to the small ice cream shop down the street. The lights twinkled in the windows, and Emily pressed her face against the glass, deciding between chocolate and strawberry. As they sat by the window, Emily swinging her feet beneath the booth, Mark realized something. He hadn't seen her this happy in months. "Daddy," Emily said, licking her ice cream. "Yet do you think Caitlin's and Angel?" Mark nearly laughed, but the Sincerity in her voice stopped him. He thought about it for a second, then smiled. Maybe, she's just someone who knows what it's like to help when it matters. Emily nodded, satisfied with the answer. As they walked home, snowflakes began to drift down from the dark sky, melting the second they touched the ground. When they got back to the apartment, Mark tucked Emily into bed. She pulled the shoebox close, whispering something he couldn't quite hear before he could leave the room. Emily looked up at him sleepily. Daddy, yeah, I love you. Mark's heart ached, the kind of ache that comes from love so pure it almost hurts. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. I love you to kiddo always. As he closed her door, Mark out at the kitchen table and opened the envelope. Once more this time, he noticed a small note tucked between the bills. In simple handwriting it read, "No act of kindness is too small. Take care of each other. CC." Mark exhaled, pressing the note against his chest for the first time in a long while. He felt like they weren't alone. Like this video and subscribe this channel. Thank you.